the Aztec Empire. Imagine you build a city. Not just any city, a city on a swamp, on a tiny island, in the middle of a lake, in the middle of a valley, in the middle of a continent nobody on the other side of the world even knows exists yet. Now imagine that city becomes one of the largest on the earth. And then, in the span of roughly 2 years, it is completely gone. That is the story of the Aztecs. And I want to be very clear right from the start. The Aztecs is already a complicated phrase. By the time we're done, you'll understand why historians spend entire careers just arguing about what to call these people. But we'll get there. For now, here's the short version. The Aztecs were a Mesoamerican civilization. They flourished in central Mexico from around 1300 to 1521 CE. That's only about 200 years. 2 centuries, the same amount of time that separates us from Napoleon Bonaparte. In historical terms, that is shockingly brief for a civilization that managed to build pyramids, run a continent-spanning empire, develop complex philosophy, maintain a dual calendar system, and sacrifice tens of thousands of people at temple inaugurations. They were, in every sense, overachievers. The Aztec Empire was not a single kingdom ruled by one people. It was a confederation, a triple alliance of 3 city-states: Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Together, they dominated central Mexico, extending political control all the way from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic and as far south as what is today Guatemala. At its peak in 1519, the empire was the most powerful force in the Western Hemisphere. And that peak, rather inconveniently for the Aztecs, happened to coincide almost exactly with the arrival of a Spanish man named Hernán Cortés. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning. Or rather, let's start with a name. Definitions. Here is a thing that doesn't get discussed enough. The Aztecs did not call themselves the Aztecs. Let that breathe for a second. The word Aztec, Aztecatl in Nahuatl, the language they spoke, means people from Aztlan. Aztlan was a mythical homeland, a place of origin. Think of it less like a geographical location and more like a founding myth. The way some cultures have an Eden or Golden Age. Aztlan was the ancestral north, the place from which several tribes claimed they had journeyed. And when those tribes finally broke apart and went their separate ways, their god, Huitzilopochtli, the war deity, told the Mexica specifically, "You are no longer Azteca, now you are Mexica." So, the people we call Aztecs called themselves the Mexica, and the country we call Mexico takes its name from them, which means, in a wonderfully circular way, Mexico is named after the people we incorrectly call Aztecs. History loves a good irony. Who coined the term Aztec as we use it today? A German scientist named Alexander von Humboldt in 1810, nearly 300 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan. He used it as a collective term for all the peoples linked by trade, religion, language, and culture to the Mexica state. Then, in 1843, historian William H. Prescott published his famous history of the conquest of Mexico, and the term spread across the world like wildfire. So, When you say Aztec, you are essentially using a label invented by a German scientist and popularized by an American historian, describing people who would have found the word faintly baffling. That's fine. Language does that. Now, what exactly does Aztec cover? And here is where it gets genuinely interesting and somewhat maddening. In the narrowest sense, Aztec refers only to the Mexica people of Tenochtitlan, that one island city, those specific people. In a slightly broader sense, it includes the Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, the three city-states that form the political engine of the empire. In the broadest sense, Aztec refers to all the various Nahuatl-speaking peoples of central Mexico in the late post-classic period. All those who shared cultural patterns, calendric systems, religious frameworks, and language. Dozens of ethnic groups, entire civilizations, each with their own histories, their own rulers, their own complexity. Some historians hate the broad usage entirely. Scholar Robert H. Barlow preferred Culhua Mexica. Pedro Carrasco preferred Tenochca Empire. Carrasco wrote that the term Aztec is, quote, of no use for understanding the ethnic complexity of ancient Mexico. He has a point. We're going to use it anyway, because sometimes convenience beats precision, and we're making a YouTube video, not a doctoral thesis. What we should understand is this. The people at the center of this story, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan, were just one piece of an extraordinarily complex cultural web. They shared with their neighbors a pantheon of gods, a dual calendar system, the cultivation of maize as the cornerstone of life, a social structure divided between the nobility, the pipiltin, and the commoners, the Macahualtin, and architectural traditions including those famous step pyramids. What was particular to the Mexica was their patron god Huitzilopochtli, their distinctive twin pyramid temples, and their ceramic styles, and their specific and rather aggressive approach to empire building, which we will discuss in great detail shortly. How do we know any of this? That's actually a fascinating question in its own right. Aztec history comes from several directions at once. There are the archaeological excavations, most famously the Templo Maya, the Great Pyramid at the heart of Tenochtitlan, which archaeologists discovered buried beneath Mexico City in the late 20th century. Quite literally, under the streets of a modern capital. The past, inconveniently refusing to stay past. There are the pictorial codices, illustrated manuscripts produced by the Aztecs themselves, sometimes entirely in images, sometimes with glyphs. Many were destroyed, some survived. There are the colonial-era texts, written accounts produced after the Spanish conquest by Spanish friars and by literate Aztec scribes who had learned the Latin alphabet and used it to record Nahuatl. The most important of these is the Florentine Codex, a 12-volume encyclopedia of Aztec life produced between 1545 and 1576 by Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún in collaboration with indigenous informants. It covers religion, history, botany, zoology, trade, medicine, essentially everything. It is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of anthropology. And then there are the eyewitness accounts of the conquest itself, including a full history written by soldier Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was there, sword in hand, and who wrote about it all afterwards with the slightly breathless energy of someone who still couldn't quite believe what he'd witnessed. Together, these sources paint a picture, an incomplete one, inevitably, because the Spanish destroyed enormous amounts of Aztec written culture deliberately and systematically. But what remains is extraordinary. Now, let's talk about where these people actually came from. History. Origins. The Nahua peoples, the broader group of Nahuatl speakers, who include the Mexica, were not originally from the highlands of central Mexico. They migrated there from the northwest, from somewhere that scholars have debated for a long time. One hypothesis points to the Bajío region around Guanajuato. This area had a population peak in the 6th century CE, followed by a sudden depopulation during a dry period, and simultaneously, around that same time, new populations appear in the Valley of Mexico. The implication is that a drought pushed Nahuatl speakers south and east into a region previously inhabited by speakers of Oto-Manguean languages, who were gradually displaced. These nomadic newcomers didn't arrive to a blank slate. They arrived into an already ancient world of civilizations, the legacy of Teotihuacan, the great city that had collapsed in the 6th century, and the subsequent rise of city-states like Cholula, Xochicalco, and later Tula. As the newcomers mixed with established Mesoamerican cultures, adopting their religious and agricultural practices, the cultural foundation for what we call Aztec civilization was gradually laid. By around 900 CE, in the post-classic period, Nahuatl-speaking city-states were becoming significant regional powers. Tula, Tenayuca, Colhuacan, Cuernavaca, the city we now call Cuernavaca. The stage was being set. But the Mexica themselves, the tribe at the center of our story, had not yet arrived. According to their own accounts, the Mexica came from the mythical north, from Aztlan, guided by their god Huitzilopochtli. They traveled with other tribes, the Tlaxcalteca, the Tepaneca, the Acolhua, and then Huitzilopochtli told the Mexica to separate, to become something distinct, to rename themselves. This is, of course, a founding myth. Most founding myths involve a divine instruction at a dramatic moment. What is striking here is the specificity. The god literally tells them to drop the name Azteca and become Mexica, identity renamed by decree, rebranding guided by the supernatural. When they finally arrived in the Valley of Mexico, they found it already crowded with city-states and competing powers. The two dominant forces were Culhuacan to the south and Azcapotzalco to the west, ruled by the Tepanecs. The Mexica were, at this stage, a minor group, landless, outsiders. The Tepanecs expelled the Mexica from Chapultepec, a wooded hill on the western shore of the lake, now a famous park in Mexico City, and executed the first Aztec royal family, almost entirely. The survivor was a queen, Chimalteochtli II. History does not always notice the survivors. The Mexica then appealed to Culhuacan for refuge. In 1299, the Culhuacan ruler, Cocoxtli, allowed them to settle in a barren, empty wasteland called Tizapan, a place nobody else wanted. The Mexica, apparently undeterred by the inhospitable conditions. Sources mention that the area was infested with snakes, which the Mexica cheerfully ate. Gradually assimilated into Culhuacan culture and acquired the prestige of Culhuacan's royal lineage, which traced back to the legendary city of Tula. By marrying into Culhua families, the Mexica connected themselves to this ancient noble heritage, and then they were expelled again. This is becoming a pattern. The Mexica were a people with an extraordinary talent for getting themselves thrown out of places. After their second expulsion, something remarkable happened. According to Aztec legend, in 1323, the Mexica received a divine sign. An eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus growing from a rock in the middle of a lake, devouring a snake. You know this image. It is on the Mexican flag. Today, this vision showed them where to build their city. The Mexica waded into Lake Texcoco and found a small, swampy, thoroughly unpromising island. And there, in 1325, they founded Tenochtitlan, on a swamp, in a lake. Because why not? Founding of Tenochtitlan. Here is an important thing to understand about Lake Texcoco in the 14th century. It wasn't empty. It was surrounded by established city-states with functioning economies, agricultural systems, and political structures. The Mexica were building on the one piece of land nobody else had bothered to claim, probably because it was underwater most of the time. What they built there over the next 2 centuries would become one of the most remarkable cities in human history. But that comes later. In 1325, they had a swamp and a prophetic eagle. In 1376, the Mexica royal dynasty was formally established, when Acamapichtli was elected as the first Hui Tlatoani, the great speaker, the supreme ruler of Tenochtitlan. And almost immediately, the political maneuvering began. In the first 50 years after the dynasty's founding, the Mexica were tributaries of Azcapotzalco, meaning they paid taxes to the Tepanec state and served as its warriors in exchange for protection and a share of conquered wealth. Tenochtitlan was, politically, a junior partner, a client state, something between an ally and a vassal. The Tepanec ruler Tezosomoc was by all accounts an extraordinarily effective political operator. Under his rule, Azcapotzalco became the dominant power in the basin of Mexico. The Mexica served his campaigns faithfully. They grew stronger in the process. They accumulated wealth, expanded their city, developed their institutions. They were learning. In 1396, Acamapichtli died. His son Huitzilihuitl became ruler, a man whose name translates rather beautifully as hummingbird feather. He married Tesosomoc's daughter, cementing the alliance between Tenochtitlan and Azcapotzalco. In 1417, Chimalpopoca. She smokes like a shield, which is quite possibly the most poetic ruler name in history, became Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. Things then got complicated. In 1418, Azcapotzalco launched a war against the Acolua people of Texcoco and killed their ruler, Ixtlilxochitl. The slain ruler's son fled into exile. His name was Nezahualcoyotl, fasting coyote. and he would become one of the most celebrated figures in Aztec history. Poet, philosopher, architect, and the ruler who would help destroy the very empire his father's killers had built. But again, getting ahead of ourselves. Chimalpopoca supported Tezozomoc's war against Texcoco, despite the fact that Ixtlilxochitl was married to Chimalpopoca's own daughter. Family loyalty in Aztec politics was frequently secondary to strategic interest, a habit that would, in the end, prove to be the civilization's most catastrophic vulnerability. Tezozomoc died in 1426, and his sons began fighting over the throne of Azcapotzalco. In this power struggle, Chimalpopoca died, probably murdered by Tezozomoc's son Maxtla, who saw the Mexica ruler as a threat. And that murder turned out to be the single most consequential political mistake in pre-Columbian Mexican history. The Triple Alliance. Because the man elected to replace Chimalpopoca was Itzcoatl, brother of the previous ruler, war-hardened, clear-eyed, and not remotely interested in remaining a vassal. Itzcoatl formed an alliance. He reached out to Nezahualcoyotl, the exiled prince of Texcoco, who had every reason to want Maxtla dead. He also recruited Totocuhuastli, ruler of Tlacopan, and notably, Maxtla's own brother. Even Maxtla's family had had enough of Maxtla. The Triple Alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan besieged Azcapotzalco. In 1428, the city fell. Maxtla was captured and sacrificed. With that single military victory, the political map of central Mexico was redrawn entirely. Tenochtitlan was no longer a vassal. It was the dominant power in the Valley of Mexico. The Triple Alliance was the new empire. And the Aztec Empire, properly speaking, had begun. What followed was immediate and systematic expansion. Itzcoatl moved quickly to consolidate control of the southern lake region. Culhuacan, Xochimilco, Cuitlahuac, Mixquic, all of which had economies built on chinampas, extraordinary man-made agricultural platforms extending into the shallow lake, essentially floating gardens of extraordinarily rich soil. Controlling these city-states meant controlling an enormous agricultural surplus. The engine of empire runs on food. Itzcoatl then turned west into the valley of Morelos, subjecting the city of Cuernavac, today's Cuernavaca. The empire was growing, and it was growing fast. Moctezuma I and the consolidation of empire. In 1440, Motuutsumatzin Iluikamina was elected Tlatoani. His name translates, and this is the actual translation, T. As he frowns like a lord, he shoots the sky. He is known to history as Moctezuma I, Moctezuma the Elder, to distinguish him from his considerably more famous grandson, who had the misfortune of being in charge when the Spanish arrived. Moctezuma I was one of the great architects of the Aztec imperial system. His first act as ruler illustrates the nature of Aztec power perfectly. He announced he wanted to enlarge the great temple of Tenochtitlan and requested that subject cities send laborers. All of them complied, except Chalco. Just Chalco, one city. That was enough to trigger 2 decades of hostilities, because in an empire built on demonstration of power, a single refusal cannot be ignored. Challenges must be answered. The logic of intimidation requires that every defiance be punished. This is not merely cruelty, it is strategy, and Moctezuma was, above all, a strategist. Under his rule, the empire expanded dramatically. He reconquered Morelos and Guerrero, then pushed northeast into the Huaxtec region of Veracruz, then southwest into the Mixtec territory of Oaxaca, subjecting the Mixtec and Zapotec peoples, requiring tribute from ancient civilizations older than the Mexica themselves. During this period, 3 city-states emerged as persistent obstacles to imperial expansion: Tlaxcala, Cholula, and Huexotzinco. They kept supplying warriors to cities that were resisting conquest. They were too strong to easily crush, and so Moctezuma adopted a different approach: low-intensity ritualized warfare called Xochiaoyotl, the Flower Wars. The Flower Wars are one of the more genuinely fascinating elements of Aztec military culture. These were formalized engagements, staged battles with agreed conventions, fought not primarily to conquer territory, but to take captives. Captives for sacrifice. Some historians have interpreted the Flower Wars as a strategy of attrition designed to slowly drain enemy manpower. Others suggest they were primarily ritual in nature. Most likely, they were both. What is certain is that Tlaxcala never fell. It remained independent, and that independence would matter enormously later. Moctezuma I also worked to consolidate the internal political structure of the empire. His brother and chief advisor, Tlacaelel, was perhaps the single most important political architect of Aztec imperialism. Introducing legal codes, reinforcing the power of the noble class, institutionalizing the practice of placing conquered rulers back on their thrones as Mexica clients. The empire was not generally a brutal occupation. It was a sophisticated web of fealty, marriage alliance, and mutual economic dependency. The conquered cities paid taxes to the Huitlahuachtli, the Great Speaker, and in return they maintained their own rulers, their own customs, their own local governance. The Aztec Empire deliberately restricted communication and trade between outlying city-states, making them dependent on Tenochtitlan for luxury goods. It is an economic model that will feel strikingly familiar to anyone who has studied imperial systems in any era. Control the supply chain. Control the empire. Axayacatl, triumph and catastrophe. In 1469, power passed to Axayacatl, Watermask, son of Itzcoatl's son Tezosomoc, and grandson of Moctezuma I. He began well. His coronation campaign went south to the Isthmus of Tehuantepec against the Zapotecs, and succeeded. He then turned his attention closer to home, the independent Mexica city of Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco sat on the northern part of the same island as Tenochtitlan. It had its own ruler, Moquihui, who happened to be married to Axayacatl's sister, and who, the records suggest, was unkind to her. Whether marital discord was the real reason, or merely a convenient pretext, Axayacatl used it. He conquered Tlatelolco and absorbed its famous market, the largest in Mesoamerica, directly into the empire's control. The market of Tlatelolco was, by all accounts, astonishing, but that's a story for another episode. Axayacatl then pushed outward. Central Guerrero, the Puebla Valley, the Gulf Coast. He was extending the empire in every direction. He conquered the Otomi and Matlatzinca peoples in the Toluca Valley. And then he decided to attack the Tarascans. This was a mistake of the first order. The Tarascan state, in what is today Michoacan, was the one major power in Mesoamerica that the Aztec Empire genuinely could not break. The Tarascans had a metallurgical tradition superior to the Mexica. They had experienced, disciplined warriors and a well-organized military command. They were ready. In 1478 to 1479, Axayacatl launched his campaign. He brought approximately 32,000 men. At the Battle of Tlaximaloyan, today the town of Tajimaroa, the Aztec army was destroyed. Axayacatl barely escaped with the remnants of his force. The vast majority of his men were dead. 32,000 men gone. The Tarascans were never conquered by the Aztec Empire. Not then, not ever. Tizoc, the cautionary tale. In 1481, Axayacatl died, and his older brother, Tizoc, became Tlatoani. Tizoc's coronation campaign, the ritual display of military power expected of every new ruler, was, to put it diplomatically, not a success. He attacked the Otomi of Metztitlan. He lost the main battle. He managed to capture 40 prisoners for his coronation sacrifice. 40, when his predecessor had sacrificed thousands. The political consequences were immediate. Subject cities rebelled. Territories that had been laboriously conquered began to slip away. Tizoc spent most of his short reign fighting to hold what his predecessors had built, rather than expanding. In 1485, Tizoc died suddenly. It has been suggested by historians, delicately, that he may have been poisoned by his own brother and war leader, Ahuitzotl, who then became the next ruler. History does not confirm this, but the timing is, shall we say, convenient. Tizoc is remembered today primarily because of the Stone of Tizoc, a monumental circular sculpture decorated with scenes of his conquests. The stone is impressive. The conquests it depicts are somewhat embellished. Even in stone, Tizoc was losing the PR battle. Ahuitzotl, the high water mark. Ahuitzotl, water monster, was everything Tizoc was not. His coronation campaign was swift and effective, suppressing rebellions in the Toluca Valley and conquering Jilotepec. A second campaign to the Gulf Coast was equally successful. He enlarged the great temple of Tenochtitlan and inaugurated its new form in 1487, with a ceremony that remains, by any measure, one of the most extreme events in recorded history. The rulers of all subject cities were invited to witness, and what they witnessed was an inauguration sacrifice of war captives on a scale never seen before or since. Some sources give a figure of 80,400 prisoners sacrificed over 4 days. Historians debate the exact number fiercely. The logistics alone make the highest figures implausible, and the actual count was probably much smaller, though still numbering in the thousands. Notably, archaeologists have never found enough skulls in the capital to satisfy even the most conservative estimates, so the numbers in the sources are almost certainly exaggerated. But they were exaggerated for a reason. The point was not merely to perform the sacrifice. The point was to terrify every ruler in the empire into absolute submission. The message was, look at what we are capable of. Now please continue paying your taxes. terror as administrative policy. Brutal, but effective. Ahuitzotl also ordered the total execution of a rebellious town in northern Guerrero and repopulated it entirely with people from the Valley of Mexico. One of the earliest examples in the record of what we would today call forced population transfer. He constructed a fortified garrison at Oztuma to defend the empire's western border against the unconquered Tarascans, who remained a perpetual threat. Under Ahuitzotl, the empire reached its geographic apex. The political reach of Tenochtitlan extended from the Pacific to the Atlantic and south into Chiapas and Guatemala. The Aztec Empire had never been larger or more powerful. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the last emperor. And then came Moctezuma II, known in full as Moctezuma. Xocoyotzin, he frowns like a lord, the youngest child. He succeeded Ahuitzotl after the latter's death. He was a son of Axayacatl, a warrior, a proven military leader. His early reign followed the familiar script: coronation campaign, conquest, expansion, consolidation. He attacked Nopalan in Oaxaca. He succeeded. He was effective. In his early years, there was no indication that his reign would end any differently from his predecessors. The empire continued to grow. The tax revenues flowed into Tenochtitlan. The great temple remained the axis of the religious and political world. And then, in 1519, on the eastern coast of the empire, ships appeared. Strange ships filled with strange men, men in metal armor, carrying weapons that made thunder and fire, men riding animals no one in Mesoamerica had ever seen. Men who, by the strangest coincidence in the history of coincidences, arrived in the year that Aztec prophecy associated with the possible return of the god Quetzalcoatl. Hernán Cortés, Spanish conquistador, had arrived. The empire that had taken 2 centuries to build, that had survived disasters, military catastrophes, famines, rebellions, and the occasional poisoning of a ruler by his own brother, would be over in 2 years. Cortés was a brilliant and ruthless strategist, but his most decisive asset was not his weapons, or his horses, or his armor. It was politics. Because the Aztec Empire was not loved. It was feared, and fear, when the feared thing suddenly seems vulnerable, transforms very quickly into something else. Cortés found allies everywhere. Most significantly, the Tlaxcalteca, the people of Tlaxcala, that city-state that had resisted the flower wars for decades, that had never fallen, that had watched the empire expand around them and had never stopped resisting, joined Cortés with enthusiasm. He also allied with the Acolhua of Texcoco, former partners in the Triple Alliance, the very people who had helped the Mexica build the empire in the first place. The empire was undone in the end by the same political contradictions that had always been at its heart. It had never truly integrated its subjects. It had controlled them through fear and economic dependency. And when the fear faltered, the whole structure began to come apart. On August 13th, 1521, after a brutal siege that lasted months and reduced Tenochtitlan to ruins, the city fell. The last emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured. He was later executed. On the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish founded Mexico City. And on the ruins of the empire, they built a colonial system that used the very same network of local nobles and city-states that the Aztecs had used. Now, to extract labor and taxes for a new overlord 3,000 miles away across the ocean. The structure of empire changed its master. The people remained. Closing. So, what do we make of the Aztecs? They were a people who started with nothing, a swamp, an island nobody wanted, a story about an eagle and a cactus. They built in 2 centuries one of the largest and most sophisticated empires the Americas had ever seen. They developed philosophy, poetry, architecture of staggering ambition, an agricultural system, the Chinampas. So effective that some versions are still in use today in the area around Mexico City. They also practiced human sacrifice on a massive scale. They ran an empire through terror and economic coercion. They were cruel to their enemies in ways that are difficult to sanitize. Both of these things are true simultaneously. History, as it turns out, is rarely populated by purely good or purely evil actors. Mostly it is populated by people doing what they believed they had to do, in the context of the world they understood. The Mexica believed their rituals sustained the cosmos. Literally. That without the sacrifices, the sun would stop moving and existence would end. They were not performing cruelty for its own sake. They were, in their understanding, keeping the world alive. That doesn't make it right. It makes it human. And humans are always more complicated than the stories we tell about them. The word Mexico, the country, the city, the people, carries the name of those small-time wanderers who arrived on a barren swamp and decided with either extraordinary faith or extraordinary stubbornness that this was where they were meant to be. They were right. For a while. And that's the story of the Aztecs.